"You're just after my money," he said. "I'm not the father of these twins." But 5 years later, the twins' faces told the truth. Rain slapped the courthouse steps as Bernice clutched 2 tiny blankets to her chest. Her hands were shaking so badly that the babies stirred, their soft cries blending with the storm. Norbert stood several feet away, his shoes already wet, his eyes darting anywhere but her face. "I'm not the father of these twins," he said, his voice cutting through the air like it didn't belong to him. 5 years later, he would beg for the chance to take those words back. But before that terrible moment ever existed, before the rain, before the silence that swallowed them whole, their story had begun in a place so gentle it felt impossible that it could ever end in heartbreak. It was a warm afternoon beside the river, in a small bookstore cafe that smelled faintly of old paper and cinnamon. Bernice had been sitting at the corner table, her mug growing cold as she pretended to read but kept glancing at the man across the room. He hadn't moved in several minutes. His eyes were fixed on the same open page, his finger resting on a single line as though the book might escape if he let go. Finally, she couldn't help herself. "You know," she said with a small grin, leaning back in her chair, "most people turn pages when they read." Norbert blinked, startled, then looked down at the book as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh," he said, closing it halfway, embarrassed. "Right, that's usually how it works, isn't it?" Bernice laughed, the soft kind that slipped out before she could stop it. "I've been watching you for 10 minutes. You look like you're guarding that page with your life." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe I am." She tilted her head. "What's so special about it?" He held the book up, then lowered it again. "Honestly, nothing. It's just, I forget where I was if I turn it too fast." Her smile widened. "So you freeze the moment." He studied her for a second, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I do." That single exchange, about a page that never turned, was how their whole world quietly opened. Bernice closed her book and slid her chair slightly closer to his table, curiosity glowing in her eyes. "So," she said, tapping the edge of his book, "you freeze moments. Is it because you're distracted, or because you like being there too much to leave?" Norbert hesitated, then smiled in a way that looked more honest than charming. "When I'm calm," he said quietly, "I reread the same sentence over and over, not because I forget it, but because I don't want it to end." She considered that. "That's the strangest reading habit I've ever heard," she said. He shrugged. "I don't get many calm moments." Her voice softened. "What makes this one calm?" He looked around the cafe, the window open to the river breeze, the low chatter of strangers, the tiny bell above the door chiming whenever someone walked in. "This," he said, "nobody expects anything from me here. I don't have to explain who I am or why I'm here." Bernice leaned back, letting his words settle between them. "I reread recipes when I'm nervous," she admitted, "not because I plan to cook them, but because it makes me feel like I have a plan." He laughed. "So we both fake control." "Exactly. Before we go any further, I want you to pause for a second. If you believe love should never be measured in money, hit the like button right now. And if stories like this touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Williams' Storytime. It helps us bring more real stories to life." A silence grew, not the awkward kind, but the kind that stretches gently, like it's waiting to be filled by something worth saying. Norbert finally broke it. "I was actually stuck on the same line when you spoke to me," he said. "It was about how some moments only feel real when you stay inside them." Bernice lifted her mug. "Then let's stay inside this one." They clinked mugs softly, 2 strangers who had no idea they were stepping into the first calm moment of a very long story. They had forgotten their books completely. Norbert leaned forward on his elbows, studying the swirl in his coffee. "So tell me something ridiculous about your childhood." Bernice didn't even pretend to think. "I wanted to be a lighthouse keeper." He burst out laughing. "That's not a job people dream about. That's a job people stumble into." She pointed at him. "That's exactly why I wanted it. I imagined I'd stand alone by the water, keeping ships from getting lost. No crowds, no noise, just the sea and a lamp." "Did you live near the sea?" "Nope, middle of nowhere. Cows and cornfields." He shook his head, amused. "I wanted to be a magician." Her eyes lit up. Really? Yeah. I was convinced that if I could learn to pull coins out of people's ears, I could control my life. She laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth. That makes no sense. It made perfect sense to a 10-year-old who didn't like surprises. They traded stories back and forth. Her obsession with building forts from couch cushions, his habit of collecting broken watches because he liked fixing things no one else bothered with. At some point, Bernice said, "You talk like someone who's always preparing for something." He paused, then forced a smile. "Maybe I am." She tilted her head. "What for?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You're good at asking dangerous questions." She smiled gently. "Only the honest ones." The bell above the door chimed again, but neither of them looked. The outside world was slowly losing its hold on them, minute by minute, laugh by laugh. Bernice rested her chin in her hands and watched a couple walk past the cafe window, arguing over something neither of them seemed ready to let go. "Can I tell you a secret?" she said. Norbert nodded. "I don't think happiness likes crowds." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold statement. I grew up in a house where everyone talked at the same time," she continued. Music playing, phones ringing, neighbors stopping by unannounced. Everyone was busy proving they were alive, but nobody ever sat still long enough to notice they were lonely. "So you escaped to lighthouses and forts," he said. "Exactly. I learned that the best moments don't announce themselves, they whisper." He studied her, as though trying to understand how someone could speak with such certainty about something so fragile. "My happiest memories," she went on, "are tiny. My mom humming while folding laundry, my dad fixing the same broken chair every year instead of buying a new one. Nothing impressive, just present." Norbert swallowed. "I don't remember quiet growing up," he said. Her eyes softened. "Then maybe that's why you like freezing sentences. You're building your own stillness." The words settled on him more heavily than he expected. Bernice reached for her book, then stopped. "Stay a little longer," she said. "We're not done finding calm yet." The waitress came by to refill their cups, and Bernice watched the steam curl upward. "So," she said casually, "what do you do when you're not guarding pages from harm?" Norbert chuckled, but it sounded thinner than before. "I move things around," he replied. She laughed. "That's not a job. That's a personality trait. I make sure pieces fit where they're supposed to," he added quickly. "Like puzzles? Like problems?" She waited, giving him space to expand, but he simply stirred his drink until the spoon clinked softly against the mug. Bernice noticed the change, the way his shoulders had lifted, the way his eyes no longer settled anywhere for long. "That didn't scare you, did it?" he asked. "What? Asking about work?" She shook her head. "I was just curious." "Well," he said, forcing a brighter tone, "curiosity has terrible timing." "Then change the subject," she replied easily. "Tell me what you do when you're not solving invisible problems." He relaxed, grateful for the exit. "I repair old radios," he said. "The kind nobody uses anymore." Her smile returned. "Now that I believe." They left the cafe together, not because either of them suggested it, but because neither of them said goodbye. The river was only a few steps away, moving gently as the day began to soften. Bernice tucked her hands into the sleeves of her sweater, even though the air was still warm. Norbert walked beside her in silence for a moment, then said, "I don't usually do this." "Do what?" "Let afternoons go without a plan." She smiled at the water. Maybe afternoons don't like being managed. They walked past families feeding ducks, past joggers who nodded politely and kept moving. The noise from the street faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of their footsteps. Bernice picked up a small stone and skipped it across the surface. It hopped twice before sinking. "I used to come here when I didn't know what I wanted," she said. "And now?" he asked. "Now I come when I don't want to pretend I know." Norbert watched the ripples fade. "That's brave." She shrugged. "It's easier than you think. You just stop running from the silence." He didn't answer, but his pace slowed, as though he were afraid of stepping out of the moment too quickly. They reached the end of the walkway, where the river bent slightly and the city seemed to hold its breath. Bernice leaned against the railing, watching the last lights scatter across the water. "You know," she said, almost to herself, "people think silence means nothing is there, but silence is usually where the heaviest things hide." Norbert turned to her. Heaviest. Things we're afraid to name, she replied. Things we don't think anyone will carry with us. He nodded slowly, the meaning settling into his posture before it reached his words. I've carried a few things too long, he admitted. She smiled, gentle but serious. Just don't let them press you down so much that you forget how to stand beside someone. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time that afternoon he felt the quiet he loved begin to feel dangerous, not because it was empty, but because it was full of everything he had not yet told her. Bernice had stopped at the corner store only to grab milk and a packet of pasta. It was the kind of quick errand that required no thought, the kind she liked doing because it made life feel light. The magazine rack stood beside the register, its glossy covers flashing headlines she never read. She was halfway through her payment when something tugged at her attention. A face, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before her mind caught up. She turned slowly and reached for the magazine at eye level. Her fingers brushed the edge as her eyes scanned the cover, her breath stalling. Norbert. Not smiling the shy way he did with her, not hiding behind a book or a coffee mug. This Norbert stood confidently beneath a bold headline about innovation and leadership. His hair was styled differently, his shoulders squared, his expression carrying a certainty she had never seen across their tiny cafe table. She paid for the magazine without realizing it, slid it into her bag, and walked the 3 blocks home as if the sidewalk had shifted under her feet. Inside their apartment, she set the groceries down and pulled the magazine free, laying it flat on the kitchen counter. The headline felt louder now. She waited. Norbert came in humming, dropping his keys into the small bowl by the door. Hey, he said easily, you won't believe how long the line was at the bank. Norbert, she said quietly, tapping the magazine with one finger. The hum stopped. He crossed the room slowly, eyes moving from her face to the cover, then back again. She met his gaze. How long were you planning to keep this from me? Norbert set his bag down carefully, as though any sudden movement might break something that was already cracking. I wanted to tell you, he said. She lifted the magazine. This seems like a good place to start. He glanced at the cover, then away. I didn't want that version of me to walk into our kitchen. So instead you brought him in through the back door? That's not fair. Her voice stayed calm, but it trembled beneath the surface. You let me believe I knew you. You do know me. Then why does this feel like meeting a stranger? He stepped closer, stopping just far enough away that she could still choose whether to close the distance. I was afraid, he admitted. Of me. Of what changes when people see that side of my life. Bernice shook her head slowly. I didn't ask you to be anything other than present. He opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing too late that there were no neat answers left. The room felt smaller, not because of raised voices, but because of everything neither of them wanted to say. Norbert pulled out a chair and sat, rubbing his palms together as if trying to warm them. I didn't grow up with people liking me, he began. They liked what I had access to. Doors opened because of my last name, not because of who I was. Bernice listened without interrupting. So I learned to become small in places where I wanted to feel real, he continued. If no one knew where I came from, then every smile was honest. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a successful man, but someone who had been protecting himself for years. I never wanted to lie to you, he said. I just didn't want to risk losing you to a version of me that doesn't feel like mine. His eyes were glassy now. I wanted to be ordinary with you. She inhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of his confession. Bernice moved to the window, staring down at the street where a child was trying to keep a balloon from floating away. I don't know what hurts more, she said. That you hid so much, or that you thought I wouldn't stay if you told me. Norbert stood behind her, not touching, giving her room. I feel like I've been holding someone else's story, she continued. All this time I thought we were learning each other together. She turned slowly, but I can also see why you did it, and that's the problem. I understand the fear even when I don't forgive the choice. He nodded, accepting the distance she placed between them. I don't need perfection, she said softly. I just need honesty before silence builds walls. The nausea had been easy to ignore at first. Bernice blamed long days and short nights, the way her body seemed slower every morning. It wasn't until she found herself sitting on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the tile because the room felt too bright, that a different thought crossed her mind. She waited 2 days before telling Norbert. When she finally did, she didn't dress it up. "I think I should see a doctor," she said quietly over dinner. He looked up. "Why?" "Because I haven't felt like myself in weeks." The next afternoon, she returned with a folded paper in her purse and a silence that pressed against her ribs. Norbert met her at the door. "What did they say?" She took a breath she hadn't practiced. "They said we're not just changing plans." He stared at her, confused. "We're becoming parents," she whispered. For a long moment he didn't speak. His face moved through disbelief, awe, and something harder to name. "Parents," he repeated, as though testing the weight of the word. She nodded. At first, Norbert tried to act the same. He asked how she was feeling. He opened doors. He made tea without being asked. But something had shifted behind his eyes, as though a curtain had been pulled just far enough to change the light. He stayed later at work. He stopped finishing sentences he had started. Bernice noticed the empty spaces first, the way he sat farther away on the couch, the way he stared at his phone even when there was nothing on the screen. One night she said, "You're here, but you're not with me." He smiled, thin and tired. "I'm just thinking a lot about us, about everything," he replied, already drifting away again. The distance didn't shout, it settled, and Bernice felt it growing even when nothing was said. The house had begun to sound different. It wasn't louder or quieter, just thinner, as though something important had stepped out and forgotten to come back. Bernice stood in the doorway one evening, watching Norbert tie his shoes for the 3rd time that day. "You're going out again?" she asked. "Just for a bit," he said, not meeting her eyes. "For work?" "For air." The door closed gently behind him, but the quiet it left behind felt anything but gentle. She lowered herself onto the couch and rested a hand against her stomach, unsure when she had started doing that. It wasn't conscious, it was instinct, the body's way of asking for steadiness when the world wobbles. Norbert still kissed her goodbye, still asked if she'd eaten, but the warmth was gone from the middle of things. Conversations stopped before they began. Plans were replaced by maybe, and we'll see. That night when he finally returned, she waited until he sat beside her. "Are you scared?" she asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "Of what?" "Of this," she said, gesturing between them, to the future they hadn't named aloud yet. His answer came slowly. "I don't know how to be what everyone expects." She nodded, a tight feeling building in her throat. "I don't need perfect," she said. "I need present." He reached for her hand, but his grip lacked the confidence it once had. In that moment, Bernice understood something she hadn't wanted to see before. Love hadn't left. Fear had simply moved in and taken the best seat in the room. The rain was not loud. It was steady, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. It slid down the tall stone walls of the courthouse and gathered at the bottom steps, forming thin streams that wound their way across the pavement. The sky had dimmed into a dull gray, not quite dark enough to signal night, not bright enough to promise relief. People hurried past with umbrellas tilted forward, collars pulled high, eager to reach anywhere else. Inside, voices echoed in narrow halls where every footstep sounded like a decision. Doors opened and closed with a hollow finality, each one marking something changed forever. Bernice stood near the entrance, barely aware of the chill soaking through her shoes. Her arms were empty for the moment, but her heart was already heavy, as though it knew what was coming before her mind would allow it. Norbert was late. She kept glancing at the tall glass doors, watching the blur of rain and motion beyond them, hoping each shape would resolve into the man she still believed would walk in and take her hand. The courthouse did not care what anyone believed. It waited in silence, holding the space where promises went when they could no longer survive the weight of fear. A nurse led Bernice into a small waiting area and gently placed 2 bundled forms into her arms. The weight was unfamiliar. Not heavy in the way objects are heavy, but in the way responsibility settles into the bones. One baby stirred, making a soft sound that caught in Bernice's chest. The other stretched slightly, then relaxed again, trusting the arms that held them. Her hands shook as she adjusted the yellow blankets, terrified she might hold them wrong even though she already knew she never would. "You're safe," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who the words were meant for. The twins smelled of soap, and something new she had no language for yet. Her body leaned toward them instinctively, forming a small shield from the wide, unfamiliar room. She sank into a chair, breath shallow, heart pounding as though it had just discovered what fear really meant. This was love stripped of ceremony. No music, no applause. Just a woman, 2 lives, and a building full of choices that could not be undone. Norbert arrived without urgency, water dripping from his coat as he stepped inside. He didn't go to Bernice right away. Instead, he moved along the wall, hands sliding into his pockets, then out again, then back in. His shoes left faint marks across the floor as he crossed the same short distance over and over, as though the room were shrinking beneath him. Bernice lifted her eyes. "Norbert," she said softly. He stopped, but he didn't turn. "I'm here," he replied, his voice tight. She waited for him to face her, to come closer, to look at the tiny forms pressed against her chest. He stared instead at a framed notice on the wall, reading it again and again without seeing a word. The silence stretched. Finally she said, "You don't have to be afraid of them." He swallowed hard. "I'm not afraid of them." "Then what are you afraid of?" He opened his mouth, then shut it, his jaw tightening as though holding something back took more strength than he had left. Bernice shifted in her chair, adjusting the twins so their faces were turned toward him. "Come closer," she said. "They don't bite." Norbert finally faced her, though his feet didn't move. "You don't understand what this means," he said. Her voice dropped, not out of weakness, but because anything louder felt like it might shatter the room. "I do understand," she replied. "I didn't plan a story. I didn't plan a rescue. I planned love." The words hovered between them, fragile but unyielding. "You always said you wanted calm," she continued. "This is calm. It's just not quiet." His eyes flicked briefly to the twins, then away again. "You don't get to be ready for this," she whispered. "You only get to be here." Norbert finally stepped forward, stopping just short of her chair. "You don't see what this looks like," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "People will think you planned this, that you wanted everything I have." Bernice stared at him, stunned. "Everything you have," she echoed. "I'm sitting here holding 2 newborns in a hallway that smells like disinfectant, and you think I'm thinking about accounts and headlines? You didn't know what my life really is like," he shot back. "You don't know the kind of pressure that comes with it." She held the twins tighter, her knuckles whitening. "I know what it costs to love you," she said, "and I've paid it gladly." He shook his head, backing away as though her words were pushing him. "You wanted security," he insisted. "You wanted a future that didn't ask too much of you." Her eyes filled, but her voice did not falter. "I wanted a family." Norbert's breathing had turned uneven, each breath shorter than the last. He looked at the floor, then at the door, anywhere but at the small faces wrapped in yellow cloth. "I can't do this," he said. Bernice shook her head slowly. "You already are." He laughed once, a hollow sound that didn't belong in a place that held new life. "You don't understand the position you've put me in." "I didn't put you anywhere," she replied. "You walked here." His shoulders lifted, then fell, like a man shedding something too heavy to carry. "I won't let you use me," he said, his voice barely above a murmur. Her eyes widened. "Use you for what?" He raised his head at last, meeting her gaze for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm not the father of these twins." The words landed without force, no shouting, no drama, and that was what made them unbearable. The baby shifted against her chest, unaware that a truth had just been denied out loud. Bernice felt something inside her go very still, as if the part of her that had been hoping simply folded in on itself. Norbert stood there for a moment longer, as though waiting for her to argue him back into the room. She didn't. Bernice lowered her eyes to the twins, brushing her thumb across the edge of one blanket, committing the shape of their faces to memory in case the world decided to keep taking things from her. Norbert took one step, then another. The sound of his shoes on the tiles seemed louder than the rain outside. She watched him go without asking him to stay, not because she didn't want him, but because love had never begged its way into her life. The doors opened, cold air rushed in, then they closed again, and just like that, the room held only 3 people, 2 who had just arrived, and 1 who had been left behind to learn how to be enough for all of them. The bus dropped Bernice at the corner of Maple and 3rd, a stop that barely deserved a sign. It was nothing like the places she and Norbert once wandered together. No cafes with shelves of novels, no polished windows that reflected dreams, just a narrow street lined with modest homes that leaned slightly toward one another as if sharing secrets. She stood there for a moment with Dahlia asleep against her shoulder and Dayton tucked carefully into the carrier, rain from earlier that morning still clinging to the air. The house was at the end of the block, its steps tilted to the left, each one uneven in a way that made Bernice test her footing twice before climbing. The front door was painted pale blue, chipped at the corners, and when she turned the key, it took effort, the lock sticking before finally yielding. Inside, the space smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. Sunlight poured through the windows as though trying to compensate for everything the place lacked. The floors creaked under her careful steps, and the living room held nothing but a couch with one sagging arm and a lamp that leaned just enough to make her nervous. Bernice set the babies down gently and looked around. "This is us now," she whispered, unsure whether she was comforting them or herself. Dahlia made a soft sound in her sleep. Dayton stretched one tiny fist free from his blanket. Bernice smiled. Crooked steps, thin walls, quiet streets. It wasn't what she had imagined for them, but for the first time since the courthouse, the future didn't feel empty. The nursery began with a borrowed crib and a box of mismatched hangers. Bernice set them down in the smallest bedroom, the one that caught the most morning light. The walls were bare, their pale paint chipped in places where previous tenants had leaned furniture too hard. She worked quietly, one careful movement at a time. A tiny blanket folded over the edge of the crib. A row of soft clothes hung neatly even though no one would see them for weeks. She pinned paper stars to the wall because she couldn't afford anything else that looked like wonder. At one point she stopped and pressed her forehead against the side of the crib. "This wasn't supposed to be lonely," she murmured. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and kept going. The room filled slowly, not with objects, but with intention. Every corner said the same thing: someone is wanted here. And when she finally stepped back, exhausted and standing in a room built from second chances, she didn't see what was missing. She saw what she was becoming. Saturday mornings in Willow Creek did not rush. They unfolded. Bernice stood in her small kitchen while Dahlia and Dayton sat at the table in their mismatched pajamas, watching the bowl as if something magical might climb out of it. "Mom," Dayton said seriously, "if you mess up the shape again, can I still eat it?" Bernice flipped the pancake carefully. "Only if you promise not to tell anyone it was supposed to be a heart." Dahlia giggled. "They're always sideways." "That's because hearts aren't meant to be perfect," Bernice replied. The pancakes piled higher, some round, some leaning toward the shape she tried to make. Syrup pooled at the edges of their plates as the twins argued over who had the bigger one. "This is mine," Dahlia said, pulling her plate closer. "They're the same," Dayton protested. Bernice watched them, tired and smiling at the same time. These mornings cost her more energy than she liked to admit, but they gave her something money never had, a reason to begin again every week. The daycare building was painted in colors meant to cheer people who were already worried. Bernice stood in the hallway holding 2 tiny backpacks that felt heavier than they had any right to. Dahlia clung to her leg. Dayton pressed his face into her coat. "You'll be right here when we come back?" Dahlia asked, eyes wide. "I'll be thinking about you every second," Bernice said, kneeling to meet their gaze. "And then I'll be back before you know it." Dayton shook his head. "I don't like the smell," Bernice forced a smile. "It just smells like new friends." She passed them gently to the teacher, hands lingering a moment too long. As the door closed, the sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and final. Bernice stood there, staring at the blank space where they had been, her chest tightening as though the building had taken more than children. She turned and walked away without looking back, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure she could move if she did. By the time the twins were finally asleep, Bernice felt as though she had lived 3 days inside one. She sat on the edge of the couch with a bowl of cereal she had forgotten to finish, listening to the soft sounds drifting from the nursery. A small sigh here, a tiny shuffle there. Her body ached in places she didn't remember owning. But when she peeked into the room and saw Dahlia curled toward her brother, Dayton's hand resting on the sleeve of her sister's pajamas, something inside her lifted. "You're the reason I'm tired," she whispered with a smile. "And the reason I'm not—" She turned off the light and let the darkness hold the house gently, knowing that in a few hours, morning would ask everything of her all over again. By the time Dahlia and Dayton learned to speak in full sentences, Bernice realized she wasn't raising a pair. She was raising two completely different worlds. Dahlia was the observer. She noticed things other children rushed past: a loose button on Bernice's coat, a bird perched too long on a wire the way the neighbor's dog always waited before crossing the street. "Mom," she would say, tugging gently at Bernice's sleeve, "do you think the moon gets lonely up there?" Dayton, on the other hand, lived with his whole chest open. If Bernice sighed, he was already at her side. If Dahlia scraped her knee, he cried harder than she did. One evening, Bernice sat at the kitchen table trying to sort through bills, her shoulders sagging. Dayton climbed into her lap without a word and wrapped his arms around her neck. "Are you sad?" he asked. She kissed his hair. "Just tired." Dahlia watched them from across the room, then nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe tired is just another word for brave," she said. Bernice blinked, caught off guard by the wisdom drifting out of a 5-year-old mouth. Two children, two ways of loving, both teaching her how to keep going. People in Willow Creek noticed her, not because she was loud or demanding, but because she was steady. She thanked the cashier by name. She returned borrowed items cleaner than she received them. She listened when neighbors spoke, even when her eyes were heavy with fatigue. Once, after a long day, a woman from down the street said, "You must be angry raising two alone." Bernice smiled politely. "Some days I'm tired enough to forget to be angry." That night, Dahlia asked, "Mom, why don't you ever talk about the man who isn't here?" Bernice tucked a blanket around her and Dayton before answering. "Because the story that matters is the one we're living," she said, "and it's too full to make room for bitterness." She kissed their foreheads and turned off the light, leaving behind a room built not from what had been taken, but from what she chose to keep. The school playground buzzed with the noise of small lives colliding, laughter, scraped knees, arguments that lasted exactly 5 minutes before dissolving into something else. Bernice stood by the fence, watching Dahlia balance carefully along the low wooden beam, while Dayton chased a red ball that was always just one step ahead of him. Then she saw Dahlia stop, not stumble, stop. Her daughter's eyes followed a man lifting his little girl high into the air, the child's laughter ringing louder than the rest of the yard. The man spun her once, then set her down gently, brushing her hair out of her eyes before jogging off to join another parent near the benches. Dahlia stayed where she was, hands hanging loosely at her sides. When the bell rang, she didn't run back like she usually did. She walked slowly, thoughtful in a way Bernice had begun to recognize as the beginning of a question. As soon as they reached the car, Dahlia climbed into the back seat and pressed her forehead to the window. "Mom," she said after a long silence, "why don't we have someone like that?" Bernice's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her heart stumbling over the shape of the question. "Like what, sweetheart?" "A dad," Dahlia replied, her voice simple, not accusing, just curious. The car felt suddenly too quiet to hold the weight of that word. That evening, the house moved more slowly. Dahlia brushed her teeth without being reminded. Dayton chose a book instead of 3. Bernice noticed every small shift, each one telling her that something had followed them home from the playground. She tucked the twins into bed and reached for the light, but Dahlia caught her wrist gently. "Yes, love. Do all kids have dads?" Bernice sat down on the edge of the mattress, feeling the weight of the day settle into her shoulders. "Families come in many shapes," she said carefully. "Some look different from others." Dayton rolled onto his side, facing his sister. "Ours has pancakes and hugs," he said. Dahlia smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed serious. "I like ours," she said. I just wonder sometimes. Bernice brushed Dahlia's hair back from her face, buying herself time. There are things about our story that belong to grown-up hearts, she said softly, not because you're not strong enough, but because you deserve to carry joy longer. Dahlia studied her mother, searching for something beneath the words. Is it a sad story? She asked. Bernice hesitated, then smiled gently. It's not finished. Dayton reached for Bernice's sleeve. Will it be happy? If this story has made you feel anything so far, please share it with someone who needs hope today. And stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. She swallowed, feeling that familiar tightness build again. I believe it will be, she said. But some chapters take longer than others. Dahlia turned onto her side, facing the wall, her questions quiet but not gone. Dayton noticed. He scooted closer to her pillow, pressing his small hand against her arm. It's okay, he whispered. We have Mom. Bernice felt something loosen inside her chest. Dahlia turned back, blinking. What if I want to know more? Dayton didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her shoulders the way he always did when she was hurt. Bernice watched them, amazed at how comfort seemed to live inside him naturally, as though he had been born carrying extra room for other people's feelings. Bernice leaned down and kissed both their foreheads. One day, she said quietly, I'll tell you the whole story. Not the hard parts first, the beautiful ones. Dahlia's eyes fluttered, heavy with sleep. Promise? I promise, Bernice replied, resting her palm between them. And when I do, you'll know that you were always wanted, even before you were here. Dayton smiled in his sleep. The light clicked off, leaving behind two small shapes curled safely in the dark, and a woman in the hallway trying to believe her own words just as much as they did. The house Norbert bought on the hill had more rooms than he ever used. At night, he walked its halls with the lights off, not because he liked the dark, but because it reminded him that nothing inside those walls required him to feel anything. The ceilings were high enough that his footsteps disappeared before they could return to him. The kitchen counters stayed clear. The living room couches remained uncreased. No one left toys behind or forgot to turn off a lamp. Once, while passing a hallway mirror, he stopped and stared at his own reflection. For a moment he imagined two small shapes racing past him, imagined the sound of a woman laughing in a room that was built to hold voices. Then the house settled again, empty as it had always been. Money had bought him space. It had not bought him company. Norbert tried, in the years after he left Bernice, to build something that felt lighter. There was a woman who loved expensive dinners and talked about the future as though it were a business plan. She left after 3 months, saying he never really arrived anywhere. Another cared about art and long weekends away, but she grew tired of speaking into silences that did not answer back. You're kind, she told him as she packed her things, but you're not here. He watched each relationship fade with the same quiet acceptance he had brought into them, as though loss were something to be expected rather than something to fight. And each time someone left, the rooms of his life became a little larger. Norbert stopped trusting sleep. It never stayed gentle for long. Some nights he stood again at the courthouse doors, coat damp, heart racing without a reason he could name. Other nights he was walking down a long hallway that never seemed to end, hearing a child cry somewhere just out of reach. He always woke before he could find the sound. Sheets twisted around his legs, breath shallow, the echo of rain clinging to him even in a room that had not heard a storm in weeks. He would sit at the edge of the bed until the dark loosened its grip, staring at the floor as though the answers might be written there. Morning came eventually, but it never erased what the night had returned to him. Norbert filled his days until there was no room left to think. Meetings, projects, deadlines that arrived before he could catch his breath. He told himself it was necessary, that staying in motion kept him protected from what waited in stillness. Each new achievement felt like a wall added to a structure he hoped would someday be tall enough to keep regret out. When colleagues praised him, he nodded politely. When awards arrived, he placed them where no one would see. He had learned early that money could prevent many kinds of pain. He was only beginning to understand that it could not prevent memory. It happened quietly, the way most changes do. One afternoon, Norbert found himself standing in the doorway of a small clothing store he did not remember entering. His eyes had settled on a rack of tiny jackets. their sleeves shorter than his fingers. He stood there longer than made sense. A clerk passed him twice, offering a smile he did not return. On his drive home, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror and felt something he had spent years avoiding. He did not want more rooms. He wanted voices in the ones he already had. That night, he did not turn on the television or check his messages. He sat in the dark, letting the quiet finally ask him the question he had avoided since the rain-soaked courthouse steps. What if walking away had not protected him at all? Norbert barely noticed the sign when he parked. The community center sat between a pharmacy and a laundromat, the kind of place people passed every day without ever stepping inside. He had come for a routine meeting that could have been anywhere, a discussion about funding, a handshake, a signature that meant very little. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of glue and paper. Children's artwork lined the walls, each piece held up by a strip of bright tape. Norbert walked slowly, checking his phone, then stopping in the middle of the corridor as a sudden burst of laughter echoed from an open door nearby. It startled him, not because it was loud, but because it felt misplaced in a building he had entered, with no intention of noticing anything at all. He slipped the phone into his pocket and glanced toward the room, telling himself he had only paused to check directions. He did not yet know that his life had just found him again. The door was propped open with a stack of paperbacks, revealing a room alive with color. Children crowded around low tables covered in glue sticks, crayons, and scattered paper shapes. At the center of the room, two kids sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing so hard they had forgotten what they were making. A girl with hair tied back in a loose ribbon held up a crooked paper crown. "Look," she said, giggling. "Mine looks like it tripped." The boy beside her snorted with laughter. It didn't trip. It gave up. Norbert felt his steps slow without his permission. Their voices carried something he could not place at first, a blend of curiosity and warmth that tugged at something deep inside him. He stood just outside the doorway, unnoticed, listening to them argue about whose glue stick was empty, whose scissors were better at cutting curves. It was ordinary. That was what made it impossible to ignore. The girl finally glanced up. Her laughter faded the moment her eyes found Norbert standing in the doorway. She tilted her head, studying him with the careful curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to look away from questions. "Mom?" she called softly toward the hallway, then stopped herself when no answer came. Her gaze returned to Norbert, tracing the shape of his face, the way his brow curved when he frowned without realizing it. "You look like us," she said, not as a joke, but as a discovery. Norbert felt the words hit him somewhere between breath and thought. "I do," he managed. She nodded slowly. "Like the mirror when it's foggy." The boy leaned closer to his sister, his voice barely reaching beyond the edge of their table. "He even smiles like Mom," he whispered. Norbert's heart stumbled. The words were not meant for him, yet they carried a certainty he had not heard spoken in years. The boy looked up then, eyes wide but not afraid. "Did you lose something?" he asked. Norbert swallowed. "I think I did." Norbert lowered himself slowly until his knees met the floor, ignoring the curious glances from other children. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, finding it hard to keep his voice steady. "I was just passing by." The girl studied him again, closer now. "You look nervous," she said. "I am," he admitted. The boy nudged a pile of paper hearts aside to make space. "You can sit with us if you want." Norbert placed his hands on the table edge, feeling suddenly smaller in a room built for small people. He had never been closer to something he had not yet earned. "I'm Norbert," he said, the name sounding unfamiliar in his own mouth. The girl smiled brightly. "I'm Dahlia." "And I'm Dayton," the boy added, tapping his paper crown proudly. "Those are beautiful names," Norbert replied. Dahlia tilted her head. "Mom picked them." Dayton leaned in. "She says names are wishes you can carry." Norbert nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Somewhere down the hallway, he heard a familiar voice. He turned his head toward the sound, heart racing in a way he could not remember feeling since before he had learned to protect himself from hope. Bernice appeared in the doorway, a clipboard tucked under her arm, ready to gather the twins for the ride home. Her steps slowed the instant she saw him. The room seemed to hold its breath. Norbert rose, unsure whether to stand or remain kneeling, caught between who he had been and who he might still become. "Bernice," he said quietly. Dahlia looked from one face to the other. "You know each other?" Bernice's eyes never left Norbert. "Yes," she answered. "A long time ago." Dayton studied them, then said, "Is he the story?" No one spoke. Norbert felt the full weight of 5 years settle into his chest. Every empty room, every night spent running from memory, every sentence he had wished he could erase. He did not reach for them. He simply stood there, finally understanding that truth had found him not in accusation, but in the faces of 2 children who had never known his absence as anything other than a mystery. The hallway outside the craft room was quiet, the kind of quiet that came only after children had been gathered and coats zipped. Norbert waited until the twins had gone ahead with a volunteer before he followed Bernice into the narrow corridor. "Bernice," he said, stopping a few steps behind her. She paused, but did not turn. "I didn't expect to see you," he continued. "I didn't expect this." She set her clipboard down on a nearby chair and folded her arms, still facing away. "What do you expect now?" she asked, her voice steady. He took a breath, longer than the others that had come before it, as if he were bracing himself against something he had avoided for years. "I don't even know how to start," he said. She turned then, meeting his eyes without softness or anger. "Then don't start with excuses," Bernice replied. Norbert looked down at his hands, then back up again. "I was afraid of being seen," he said, "not admired, seen. I spent my life thinking that if people knew the whole of me, they would only notice what I had, not who I was." He took a step closer, careful not to cross whatever boundary she still held. "When you told me about the twins, all I could hear was every expectation I had ever run from. I told myself I was protecting something, but I was only hiding." His voice cracked. "I left because I didn't know how to stay." Norbert waited for her to speak. She didn't. Bernice rested one hand on the back of the chair, her knuckles pale, eyes steady on the scuffed floor between them. The hallway felt smaller with every second that passed. He shifted his weight, unsure what to do with the space her silence created. "I'm not asking for anything," he added, almost desperately. "I just needed you to know." She inhaled slowly, the sound barely there, and kept listening. For the first time in years, Norbert understood how much courage it took not to answer. Bernice lifted her eyes at last. "You don't get to repair 5 years with one conversation," she said quietly, "and I won't pretend otherwise just because it would be easier." Norbert nodded, the weight of her words settling without protest. "The children don't need speeches," she continued. "They need consistency. They need someone who doesn't disappear when things become heavy." She picked up her clipboard. "If you want to be part of their lives, you'll have to learn how to stay when silence gets uncomfortable." Then she walked past him down the hallway, leaving him alone with a truth he could no longer deny. The kitchen table was smaller than Norbert remembered tables being. He had arrived with nothing in his hands except a promise to stay, and now he sat between 2 chairs meant for children, his knees brushing the underside as Dahlia spread her worksheets across the surface. "I don't get this," she said, pointing at a row of numbers. "They all look the same after a while." Norbert leaned closer. "Let's find the one that feels different." Dayton watched them, pencil held upside down. "Is it okay if I color instead?" Bernice hovered in the doorway, pretending to sort mail while actually measuring every breath Norbert took. Dahlia solved one problem, then another. Each small success pulled a smile from her that Norbert felt as if he had earned only by staying in the chair. When she finally leaned back, satisfied, Dayton tugged on Norbert's sleeve. "You're good at not rushing," he said. Norbert smiled at that, a real one, not the careful kind, and Bernice, unseen, pressed her lips together to keep from crying. The auditorium seats were too close together. Norbert arrived early, unsure where to place his hands or his attention. When Bernice entered with the twins, she paused, then took the empty seats beside him without a word. Dahlia fidgeted with her costume wings. Dayton kicked his shoes against the chair in front of him. "Stop that," Bernice whispered. Norbert leaned down. "They don't make chairs for legs that excited," he said softly. Dayton stifled a laugh. The curtain rose on children who forgot lines, sang off-key, and waved enthusiastically at parents they could barely see. Norbert clapped too loudly at the wrong times. Bernice hid a smile behind her hand. For the first time since Willow Creek, they were not strangers occupying the same space. They were simply there. Trust did not arrive all at once. It crept in between shared pencils, between jackets zipped too slowly, between moments when Norbert forgot to prove anything and simply listened. One afternoon, Dahlia asked him to help her with a project that had nothing to do with school. Another day, Dayton handed him a broken toy without explanation, certain that he would understand the request. Bernice noticed the change before Norbert did. The way the twins waited for him to speak before starting dinner, the way their eyes searched for him in a room that had once held only her. It was not forgiveness yet. It was something quieter, belief. They were sitting on the floor sorting puzzle pieces when Dayton looked up suddenly. "He belongs with us," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just as though he had noticed a missing chair finally filled. Norbert froze. Bernice held her breath. Dahlia glanced at her brother, then at Norbert. After a moment she nodded. No one said anything else. Nothing needed to be. Bernice waited until the house had settled. The twins were in their room, voices fading into sleep, and Norbert was outside on the porch, talking quietly on his phone about a meeting he would not stay late for. She closed the bathroom door and leaned her forehead against the mirror. For 5 years she had held herself together with schedules, routines, lists written on the backs of envelopes. She had learned how to be steady even when she felt hollow. She had learned how to answer questions with gentleness when her chest wanted to collapse. Now, standing in that narrow space with the light too bright and the floor too cold, she finally let go. Her shoulders shook first, then the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, just a release she had postponed since the day she stood on courthouse steps holding 2 lives alone. "He belongs with us." The words echoed in her mind. She pressed a hand to her mouth to keep from making a sound, because mothers in small houses do not have the luxury of falling apart where anyone can see. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes were red, her face unfamiliar, but beneath the exhaustion and the ache, something new had taken root. Not certainty, hope, and for the first time in years, she didn't wipe it away. The kitchen filled before the sun had fully decided to rise. Dahlia stood on a chair beside the stove, stirring batter with serious concentration, while Dayton sat at the table arranging forks into patterns only he seemed to understand. Norbert flipped pancakes carefully, watching steam drift upward like it might carry something precious away if he wasn't paying attention. Bernice leaned in the doorway with her mug, saying nothing, but seeing everything. "Mom," Dahlia announced, "these ones are hearts today." Dayton looked up. "They don't have to be perfect, right?" Bernice smiled. "They never were." Norbert placed a slightly crooked pancake on a plate and slid it across the table. Dahlia beamed at him as if he had just done something extraordinary. And in that small kitchen, mismatched chairs, humming refrigerator, sunlight landing wherever it pleased, the truth began to settle in quietly. Not all families are born at once. Some are returned to, one morning at a time. Norbert rinsed the pan at the sink, listening to the twins argue over syrup as if the sound were a privilege he had not yet earned. 5 years ago, he had stood in a building that smelled like rain and polish and said words he had rehearsed only in panic. "I'm not the father of these twins." He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory pass through him without resistance. Back then, he believed escape was strength. He believed distance was safety. He had mistaken retreat for wisdom. Now, watching Bernice swipe Dayton's chin while Dahlia explained the rules of a game he did not understand, he finally grasped what those words had cost. Not money, time, the only thing he could never return in full. Dahlia burst into laughter first. It came out of nowhere, loud and full, and Dayton followed instantly, tipping his chair back until Bernice caught him just in time. Norbert turned from the sink, startled, then smiling before he could stop himself. "What did I miss?" he asked. Dayton wiped syrup from his fingers. "She said you flip pancakes like you're apologizing to them." Bernice laughed too, the sound sliding into the room with a warmth that had been absent for years. Norbert leaned against the counter, watching the 3 of them together, and felt something he had once believed he had forfeited. Belonging. The kitchen no longer echoed, it held. Norbert set the dish towel aside and joined them at the table, unsure whether to speak or simply stay. Dahlia slid her plate toward him. "You can have the biggest one," she said, generous without knowing why. Dayton nodded. You're tall. Tall people need more. Bernice watched him accept the plate, her hand still for once. 5 years earlier, he had walked away from a hallway that held everything he was afraid to become. Now he sat in a small Willow Creek kitchen that held nothing he could escape. He had once said he was not their father. A truth had never chased him down with noise or anger. It had waited, inside two children who laughed without needing to know what had been lost, inside a woman who had built a home from patience instead of blame. Norbert lifted his eyes to Bernice, not asking for forgiveness, not reaching for promises, only staying, and in that stillness, he finally understood what the twins had known all along. Love does not demand to be believed. It waits to be lived. If this story reminded you that love can find its way back, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Mr. Williams' Storytime. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that heals, teaches, and lifts your heart.